Few things could make a girl's heart pound like a human. They were huge, crushingly strong, fast and cunning and violent, terrifying creatures. Vala knew all about terrifying. She hadn't known it could be sexy. Vala pushed the light rod deeper into her mouth. She'd almost dropped it again. She couldn't afford that. Dropping the rod would make noise. Noise was bad. She didn't like carrying the light this way, but she didn't have a choice. The ventilation shafts were safer than the corridors, but they weren't safe. She needed her hands free. The vents were cold, claustrophobic, dirty. Vala didn't know how a spaceship could be so full of grit and grime. The metal walls leached the heat from her body, but fear and exertion still had her sweating. Dust smeared into mud on her bare skin and the sad remains of the clothes she had left. A light breeze traversed the shafts, distributing oxygen throughout the ship. It was also distributing Vala's scent, but there was nothing she could do about it. The dim cone issuing from the light rod was the only illumination. Whoever built this ship hadn't bothered putting lights in the HVAC system. Why would they? Vala was lucky she could fit through the air shafts at all, not that she could use them much longer. The cone of light was growing weak, the rod almost out of power. She hoped she found another light source soon. Without one, she'd have to risk moving through the corridors. That wouldn't end well. Vala's hands were wrapped tight around a different kind of rod. She didn't know what the hunk of metal had been in its previous life. Now it was a 3-foot-long iron pole with one end crudely sharpened. The improvised spear hadn't done its previous owner any good, but it had saved Vala's life twice so far. She'd much rather have relied on the laser gun on her hip, but it was out of charge. The few power cells she'd managed to scavenge weren't compatible with her gear. Vala crawled slowly, carefully. Her spear stayed in front of her, illuminated by the light rod in her mouth. The vent was cramped, and the metal felt thin. Vala had spent hours and hours in the vents, and she still worried that one of them would give way, dropping her and her pathetic spear to face a fate she'd rather not think about. The hardest part was being quiet. Periodically, her sharpened rod would scrape against the wall of the vent shaft, or she'd bang an elbow against the side. In some places, the vent would shift and groan under her weight, no matter how careful she tried to be. At each sound, Vala froze, listened, waited. Most of the time, she heard nothing. Sometimes she heard movement. Once, she'd been found. The thing had torn its way into the shaft. She'd barely gotten away. There it was, an opening. The grate was closed, but she could open it easily enough. Not yet, though. Vala was pretty sure she'd found the crew quarters, but she wasn't positive, nor did she know if said quarters would be empty. Vala risked taking the light rod out of her mouth, flashing it up and down the ventilation duct. Nothing. Good. She crept forward until her eyes were over the grating. She couldn't see anything. Too dark. Vala barely stopped herself letting out an annoyed huff. She kept her breath shallow and quiet. She hovered the light rod over the grate, squinting down into the room. Vala moved the light back and forth slowly, then rose. The room was occupied. The light shone down on a thick, leathery leg, dark green, so dark it was almost black. The leg was splayed out, finger-like toes ending in curved, wicked claws. The leg moved as the creature shifted onto its side. The tail came into view, 7 feet long, thick but supple. The tail ended in a 6-inch stinger that narrowed to a needle point. Vala's breath caught. Was it asleep? She hoped it was. It was laying down at least. Vala carefully moved the light away from the grating. As she did, the tip of her short spear scraped against the side of the air shaft. Vala froze. The creature didn't stir. After a tense, sweaty minute, Vala moved on. She passed 3 more openings. 2 of the rooms had lights on and looked empty, but Vala didn't risk dropping down. Too close. The 3rd opening was dark, but Vala didn't see any monsters when she shined her light down. She moved on, stopping at the next grate. The light was on. The door was closed. It was as good as she was going to get. Vala slid the grating open. She put her head through the opening and looked around one more time. She was still alone. Satisfied, Vala carefully crawled over the opening, then backed up. She let her feet slide out of the hole and lowered herself as gently as she could. There was still a bit of a drop, but it was as close to silent as Vala could manage. She stayed still for a moment, listening. Nothing. So far, so good. Vala ran her eyes over the room. It was small, cramped, a tiny space with a cot and a clothes locker, and not much else. It was not like Vala's room on her own ship. Not that she'd be seeing that room again. Vala's jaw tightened. It had been 2 weeks since that bastard Vinta abandoned her, turned tail and left her to die. Not just her, everyone. The whole rest of the crew had been on the derelict when things went sideways. Now, she was the only one left. Vala very much wanted to make that Pudok pay. She knew she wouldn't. She was going to die here. The only question was whether she'd starve to death or be eaten alive. Or freeze, maybe, if the life support gave out. Speaking of starving to death, she should get to work. Vala's hunger was the reason she'd been crawling through the HVAC. Well, technically, her thirst. She'd been out of food for 2 days, but once the water ran out, she had to move. Before anything else, Vala grabbed a small end table and positioned it under the vent. She'd need it to climb back into the opening. She'd learned the hard way that the things outside were smart enough to open doors. She wanted her escape route nice and accessible. That done, she walked into the tiny bathroom attached to the sleeping area. She couldn't help but stop when she saw herself in the mirror. Vala was a wreck. Her skin, once a blue so healthy it shined, was rough and caked with grime. Her white hair wasn't soft and sleek anymore. It fell down her back in tangled, dirty snarls. Her eyes were still a vibrant violet, but there were dark circles under them. Was her face thinner now? It was. All of her was. Her muscles were smaller, and she could see a hint of her ribs under her skin. It had only been 2 weeks. How had she changed so much? Vala's clothes were in even worse shape. She'd lost her coveralls on the first day, leaving only undergarments. They were just as grimy as the rest of her. There was just enough left of her black shirt to preserve her decency. The rest of it was wrapped around her leg as makeshift bandages. Her boots were stored in her hidey hole. They made too much noise when she tried to climb through the HVAC. The only other things she wore were pink underwear and a tool belt cinched tight. She was covered in bruises, scrapes, and lacerations. There was a sizable welt in her abdomen, where one of the smaller things had stung her. She'd killed it just before the venom took hold, then spent 4 paralyzed hours lying on its corpse. Her whole body hurt, but the sting was the worst. It even beat out the gashes on her leg. Vala shook her head and turned away from the mirror. She spared a longing look at the shower. Gods, what she wouldn't give to get clean. The derelict's plumbing still worked. There was a shower right there for the taking, but Vala wasn't ready to die for it just yet. With a sigh, she moved to the sink. There were 2 canteens on Vala's tool belt. She pulled one out and unscrewed the cap, held it under the faucet. She winced at the noise when she turned the water on. The canteen filled slowly. When it was finished, she drank half of it and filled it again. She was pulling out her second canteen when she heard a thump behind her. Close. Vala snatched up her spear and turned. There was a creature on the end table below the vents, a small one, juvenile. Slitted yellow eyes, green leathery skin, 4 strong legs ending in claws, a mouth full of sharp teeth, a raised tail with a stinger on the end. Frills extended from the back of its neck to frame its open maw. Vala didn't wait for the thing to move. She rushed it. The creature let out a deafening high-pitched screech. It gathered itself for a leap. Vala was faster. She thrust a spear with both hands and her full body weight behind it. The monster aborted its jump, trying to shift out of the way. It partly succeeded. Vala's sharpened rod slammed into the side of its chest instead of dead center. The spear didn't penetrate as far as she would have liked either. The thing's skin was tough. The monster was only 3 feet long, not counting the tail. It still didn't weigh much less than Vala, and it was absurdly strong. Its clawed front leg knocked the spear out of Vala's hand. She scrambled for it, jerking her head back just in time to avoid taking a stinger to the face. She stabbed it again, but with only one hand, the spear didn't have enough force to penetrate. The creature backed up, still making its awful screech. The sound pumped adrenaline up and down Vala's legs. It was calling. The others would come. She had to kill it. She had to kill it now. The monster overcorrected. When Vala tried to stab it again, it fell backwards, taking the table with it. Vala was just starting to dart around the table when she heard it. A telltale hiss. The door behind her was opening. The big one must have woken up. It was going to tear her apart if she was lucky. If she was unlucky, it would sting her, then eat her while she was alive and paralyzed. She had one chance. Vala turned and lunged, thrusting her spear with all the strength and speed she could muster. She dimly registered a large shape and aimed her sharpened rod for the center of it. The spear stopped. The creature had caught it. Vala stared at the thing. It wasn't what she'd expected. This was not a four-legged mass of claws and stingers. It was a two-armed biped like Vala, if Vala happened to be a mountain of muscle. The biped towered over Vala. She was tall for a Phala, but she barely came up to its sternum. Its arms were bigger than Vala's legs. One meaty hand was clamped on Vala's spear. She jerked it, but it might as well have been stuck in a steel vise. The biped stepped forward, its other hand thrust out. A wide palm shoved into Vala's chest, launching her across the tiny room. She landed on the cot, but the back of her head bounced off the metal bulkhead. Strong. He was so strong. He? Vala barely tried to focus on the newcomer. Definitely a he. Not a monster. An alien. He wore a white tank top, black pants, a tool belt, and several bulky guns of foreign design. His skin was pale, pink or maybe peach-colored. His hair was short and black. His jaw was thick. His eyes were dark and glittered with violence. He might be a monster after all. He took her spear in one hand and made 2 long strides. The other monster had just climbed onto the upended table, frills extended, screeching. The biped slammed the sharpened rod down through its skull with terrific force. The little one fell silent. Muscles rippled as the alien jerked the spear out of the creature. He slapped a hand on the door panel. The door hissed closed. The alien turned to Vala. She fumbled for her laser gun. Maybe he wouldn't know she was out of charge. She pointed it at the monstrous hulk. The biped shifted the sharpened rod to his left hand. He held out his right. His voice was a low, smooth rumble. "Come with me if you want to live." Vala stared at him, useless gun still pointed at his chest. The man held her gaze seriously for 2 seconds. Then he giggled. He clamped a hand over his mouth, trying to keep himself quiet as his face contorted in laughter. "Oh man, I've always wanted to say that." Vala continued to stare at the crazy giant. He got his laughter under control and frowned at her. "Miss, can you understand me?" He kept his voice low. Vala opened her mouth, but she didn't know what to say. The biped's concern deepened. "Do you not have a translator microbes?" Vala felt herself nod. Translator microbes. The giant had them. That meant he was a known sapient, a member of the galactic community. It didn't make him safe, but he was probably less dangerous than the things outside. At least, she hoped he was. If he meant her harm, she didn't think she could stop him. What are you?" "Never seen a human before, huh?" The man smiled. It was a nice smile, but Vala was not reassured. She'd seen how casually the human had dispensed violence. "Makes sense. You're only the second Phyla I've met. The name's Mitch. Mitch Donnelly." "You're..." Vala was still staring. "You're so big." The human chuckled again. "You're not the first girl to say that to me." He flipped the sharpened rod in the air and caught it, holding it out to Vala handle first. "Here. If that laser gun worked, you'd have been using it." Vala took the proffered spear. The human had blood on his hand from where he'd caught the tip of it. He wiped it on his pants. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Rescuing you, apparently." The man's eyes roved around the room, taking everything in. "Binta didn't mention survivors when he sold me these coordinates. Are there more of you?" Vala shook her head. Vinta? She hissed. That Pudok stranded us here, stole my ship. I'm the only one left. I'm sorry to hear that. The mountain of muscle sounded sincere. He might have said something else, but there was a scrabbling sound at the door. It hissed open. Vala hopped off the bunk and clutched her spear. It was one of the creatures, probably the one Vala had seen in the other room. Its head was higher than Vala's. The thing's frills snapped out. It let out a terrible, high-pitched scream. Then there were 3 sharp cracks of thunder. The creature fell dead. The human had one of his guns pointed at it. Smoke wisped out of the barrel. The man swore. So much for doing this the quiet way. You got a name, little lady? Vala, she told him. Her ears were ringing. The human's gun was loud. Nice to meet you, Vala. Mitch dug into one of his pockets and held out a pair of objects. Here, take these. Hearing protection. Vala took the little pellets. She noticed the human had ones just like them stuck in his ears. She put the plugs in her ears as well. They let out a faint hum, then fell silent. They double as a comm link, the man told her, in case we get separated. In the distance, Vala could hear the high-pitched squeals of more monsters. Stay close. We've got to move. The human stepped into the hallway. His steps were frighteningly silent for such a hulking mass of a man. Vala followed. The alien was going out of his way to be non-threatening, even turning his back to her after handing her a spear. She still wasn't sure she could trust him, but she did not want to be left behind. Frightening as Mitch was, he was the only chance Vala had to get off this God's forsaken ship. Why did you come here? Vala asked again. Salvage, the human explained. Humans are pretty new to the galactic stage. Our government pays a pretty penny for alien technology. The ship will be one hell of a payday once we clear out the Skreelings. Skreelings? Was that the name of the monsters? You know what they are? A bioweapon. Mitch stalked down the corridor. The hallway was dark. The human turned on a light rod under the barrel of his gun. Vala pulled out her own light rod, thankful she didn't have to carry it in her teeth this time. Their real name is just a series of letters and numbers, but we call them Skreelings because of the sound they make. This tub's a Brulik vessel. They like to drop Skreelings on pre-FTL worlds. Let the bastards wipe out the locals. Only sometimes the critters get loose and eat everyone. Vala played her light over the man's back. It was just as meaty as the rest of him. She'd never seen such broad shoulders. How do you know that? She asked. She was staring at his arms. She felt her cheeks flush when she realized. This was no time for arousal. There were things trying to eat her. She made herself move the light, look behind her. More Skreelings screeched ahead of them. Closer now. They tried it on one of our colonies, Mitch explained. It was our first contact with an alien species. He frowned down at Vala and her spear. That stick's not gonna do you much good when things get hairy. You know how to use a firearm? I don't know, Vala admitted. Is it like a laser gun? Pretty close. The human let go of his long gun, letting it hang from the sling attached to him. He pulled a smaller weapon off of his tool belt. This is a pistol, 45 caliber ACP. It's got 8 shots in the clip. There's a round chambered, and there's no safety, so you can just point it and pull the trigger. Vala took the gun. It had looked small in Mitch's hands. It didn't feel small in hers. It was heavier than she expected. 2 pounds, maybe a little more. What does it do? It's kinetic, said Mitch. Metal projectiles launched at high speed through chemical explosion. Keep your fingers off the trigger until it's time to shoot. I don't want any accidents. 8 shots. Vala swallowed. Her laser gun had been able to fire 30 before needing a new power cell. Then again, she'd needed almost 10 shots to put down a Skreeling. The human's weapon was probably much more powerful. The squeals increased in volume. 3 monsters burst out of a side corridor. Vala raised her pistol, but the human was in the way. She squeezed to the side, trying to get a bead on things. She needn't have bothered. Mitch raised his weapon and squeezed off 6 shots in 3 seconds. All of the Skreelings fell. 2 of them were still alive. Mitch shot them again. He hadn't even broken stride. "Looks like we're doing things a fun way." The human was speaking under his breath, but his voice was funneled into Vala's earplugs. "What are we doing?" she asked. She looked around the dark corridor, trying to get her bearings. "Is this the way to your ship?" "Nope." Mitch pointed his weapon at any open doors as he stalked down the corridor. His bulk took up most of the hallway, and his head was dangerously close to brushing the ceiling. The way he moved was both frightening and sensual. Smooth, graceful motion, muscles playing against each other in perfect sync as he stalked forward like some ancient primal predator. "I said before we need to clear out the Skreelings. That's what I'm gonna do." "Clear out the..." Vala hissed. "Are you insane? There are hundreds of them." "Thousands, probably," Mitch agreed. "Skreelings breed fast. They were designed to." The man spun around, his gun weaved over Vala's head. She whipped around to see what he was pointing at. More Skreelings, at least 5, coming fast. Vala raised her gun. She pulled the trigger. The .45 jumped in her hand. The human fired his own weapon. He put the Skreelings down with careful shots, spaced half a second apart. Vala helped. She used all 8 shots. When the last one died, Mitch pulled a cartridge out of his gun and put a new one in. She turned to Mitch, but the human had his back to her. He was shooting again, more Skreelings coming from the front. Mitch mowed them down. He checked behind them again, then swept his light up and down the darkened corridor. He held out a hand. "Gun." Vala passed over her empty pistol. "You can't possibly think you can kill them all yourself," she told him. "I don't need to." The human reloaded the pistol and handed it back. "I was on my way to engineering when I heard you fighting the little one. Skreelings need air just like everyone else. I'm going to shut down life support. Then we'll head back to my ship and spend a few quiet days waiting for them to asphyxiate or freeze to death." "How do you know they won't turn life support back on?" Vala asked. "They're smart," Mitch told her. "But they're not that smart." The human shrugged his massive shoulders. "Probably if they start manipulating technology, I'll have to come up with a new plan." He fired a round into an open doorway. A Skreeling crashed into his legs, nearly knocking him over. Vala shot it, but it was already dead. The human moved on, complaining about tiny corridors. It took a little under 10 minutes to reach engineering. Skreelings were still coming in 1s and 2s. At one point, a little one burst out of a vent and nearly landed on Mitch. Vala shot it in midair. She was proud of that one, or she would be once her legs stopped shaking. Crawling through the vents had been bad. This was so much worse. How could the human be so calm? Mitch slapped a door panel. The entrance hissed open. Engineering was brightly lit. Thank the gods. A wide space, crammed full of machinery. The floors and walls were spattered with old blood and smeared with excrement. The smell was awful, but there were no bodies. The Skreelings had either eaten them all or carried them away. The human spent a few precious moments sweeping his gaze and his gun over the room. No monsters. It made sense, Vala supposed. There was nothing left to eat here. She'd seen Skreelings eat all sorts of things, clothes, furniture, people, but not metal. Mitch closed the door and hustled for a control station. "Cover me," he said. "This won't take long." Vala stood close to the human. The acrid scent of gun smoke clung to him, but beneath it he smelled good. Really good. Soap and a hint of sweat mixed with the natural scent of his skin. She liked it a lot. She caught herself staring at him again and made herself go back to watching the vents and the doors. She wished she smelled that good. She probably stank worse than engineering. It was quiet at first. Vala heard nothing but the human's fingers typing at the control station. Then she heard the human swearing under his breath. The translator microbes were letting him read the language, but that didn't mean he knew how to navigate the computer. He'd been messing with it for 5 minutes when the screeching started. This wasn't the screeching of Skreelings on the hunt. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm. Mitch heard it too. Oh, that's not good. What's happening? Vala asked. Her heart had finally slowed down after a few idle minutes. Now it picked up again. We've been dealing with individuals in small groups up till now, said the human. The Skreelings don't know what gunfire is. The noise will draw hunters if they're close, but the rest won't bother. A trail of dead bodies, on the other hand. He scowled, still typing. They're not sentimental, but they'll recognize a threat to the hive. We need to hurry this along. A chill swept down Vala's legs. They're talking, aren't they? Coordinating, Mitch confirmed. The way back's going to be a lot more dangerous. The Skreelings were getting louder. Mitch typed faster. Vala's tension ratcheted. 2 minutes later, the human made a fist. Got it. The soft, omnipresent hum of the HVAC system wound down. Let's go. Vala started for the door. Mitch grabbed her arm. Not that way. He let go quickly. Vala rubbed where he'd grabbed her. She didn't think he'd been trying to hurt her, but his grip was so strong. They're massing up. They'll get a few hundred together and follow our trail, swarm us like ants. Mitch walked to a different hatch. We need a different route to the airlock. Do you know another way? Vala asked. Her whole body was clenched. Yeah. Mitch slapped a door panel and readied his assault rifle. The door opened. Nothing jumped out at them. Mitch flicked on his flashlight and stepped through. Should be a ladder somewhere down this corridor. We need to go up 5 decks. The human didn't walk this time. He jogged, rifle at the ready. The pace was brisk, but Vala suspected he was going slower than he would if he wasn't worried about her keeping up. Vala was grateful. She couldn't have gone much faster. She was starved, dehydrated, beaten, and exhausted. Also, her legs were shorter than his. It took just under a minute to find an access ladder. Mitch played his flashlight up at it, then ran it over the corridor. Satisfied, he let his rifle drop and pulled out a pistol, a much bigger one than Vala's. He pulled another flashlight off his belt and clipped it to the gun. This is gonna suck, he muttered. He took a breath and put a hand on the ladder. Watch our backs. If something gets me, go up 5 decks and follow the hallway in the direction we came from. Should be a straight shot to the airlock. He started to climb. Mitch led the way with his pistol, squeezing through the opening to the next floor. Vala could see why he was worried. If there was a Skreeling waiting, the human was probably dead. When his feet climbed past the opening, Vala started to clamber up behind him. They were lucky. Nothing was waiting. The human stopped at each floor, poking his head and gun out before climbing the rest of the way. The whole climb took barely a minute, but Vala's blood was pounding in her ears by the end of it. She dearly wished she could be using the air shafts again. She would have, if that hulking mass of a human wasn't too big to fit in one. Okay, Mitch huffed quietly. It's a straight shot down the hallway. Go, I'll be right behind you. Do you have many more mags? Vala asked. She only had 2 more bullets in her pistol. No. The human admitted. He handed over his other handgun. It was bigger and heavier than the .45. Take the Deagle. It's got 8 rounds, more recoil than the .45, but it shouldn't be too bad. Vala nodded. The scree of the monsters was closer now, too close. Now go. Mitch hefted his assault rifle. Run. Vala ran. She started with a pistol in each fist, but the Deagle was too unwieldy. She tucked the .45 into her tool belt so she could keep both hands on the bigger gun. Its flashlight was brighter than the old light rod, illuminating a wide stretch of the corridor in a cone of blinding light. Mitch jogged easily behind her. The butt of his rifle tucked into his shoulder. The Skreeling were calling from all around them now. It didn't sound like they were on this deck yet, but it was only a matter of time. They'd been jogging for over a minute when Mitch cursed. His gun boomed. Vala spared a glance and nearly soiled herself. Skreelings were spilling down the hallway toward them, fast, too fast. Mitch emptied his mag into them, reloaded, then scooped Vala up. He slung her over his shoulder and sprinted for all he was worth. Even carrying Vala, the human moved like the wind. It wouldn't be enough. The Skreelings were almost on them. Vala raised the deagle. It was hard to aim. Mitch was fast, but he was not a smooth ride. Vala squeezed off a shot. She missed. The gun kicked up. She forced it down and tried again. Another miss. The lead Skreeling took up most of the hallway. It was so big, Vala was surprised it could fit through the ladder hatch. It was only 12 feet away when her third shot caught it in the foreleg. The monster tumbled. The fourth shot missed again, but killed one of the ones behind the thing. Vala fired off all 8 shots. She hit 2 more Skreelings. She didn't know if she killed them. She tried to tuck the gun into her tool belt, but ended up dropping it. Vala swore as she pulled out the .45 and used the last 2 shots. Mitch stumbled to a halt. They were at the airlock. He dropped Vala like a sack of laundry and typed hurriedly into the door control. Then he spun around and unloaded his assault rifle. Vala heard the airlock cycling. She didn't know if they'd hold out long enough for the door to open. The corridor was full of Skreelings as far as Vala could see. Their screes would be deafening if she didn't have the human's hearing protection. Mitch's gun ran out of ammo. He let it drop, pulling his last gun off his back. It was a little shorter than his assault rifle, with a thicker barrel. The human was huffing and growling. "Come on, come on!" The new gun boomed. Mitch jerked on the barrel. A big red casing ejected. He fired again and again. Finally, the airlock hissed open. Vala scrambled inside. Mitch followed, unloading the big gun into a tide of claws and stingers and death. Vala found the inner door panel and activated it. The last thing she saw before the hatch hissed shut was a Skreeling in mid-leap. The thing slammed into the closing door and fell back. The airlock finished hissing shut. Mitch brushed Vala aside and typed into the panel. "Sorry," he gasped. "Gotta lock this." His chest heaved as the human gulped huge breaths of air. The panel beeped at him. The man slumped. He sat down with his back against the bulkhead. For 15 seconds, he just sat there and gasped. Then he started to laugh. "Oh, man." Mitch's face split into a grin. "What a rush. I haven't done anything like that in years." "You thought that was fun?" Vala stared at the man. "Nothing like almost dying to make you feel alive," said the madman. He hauled himself to his feet. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up and get some food in you. It's been a long day." Mitch took Vala to his quarters. It was big like the rest of him, tall ceilings and lots of space. He pulled a first aid kit out from under his bunk, then pointed at some lockers bolted onto the wall. "There's clothes in there. I don't have anything in your size, but help yourself." He pointed to another hatch. "The bathroom's there. The plumbing on this boat is top-notch, so take your time in the shower. I'm gonna go set you up your own set of quarters. Give you some privacy." Then he left. Vala spent a long time in the shower. Terror and grief washed over her as hot water peeled away the grime. It was over. She was safe. She found herself huddled on the floor, bawling her eyes out, as soothing hot wetness rained down. She was safe. Eventually, she cried herself out. The water was still hot. Mitch hadn't been joking about the plumbing. Vala scrubbed and scrubbed, scouring her skin and hair with soaps that smelled like the human. When she was finally finished, she pulled out the first aid kit and slathered disinfectant and bandages all over herself. She went through Mitch's drawers, eventually settling on a simple white shirt. It was so big she could wear it like a dress. She borrowed the human's comb and painstakingly brushed the snarls out of her hair. Borrowed his toothbrush, too. It left a minty flavor in her mouth. She found Mitch waiting in the hallway outside. His eyebrows rose when he saw her. "Oh, wow," said the human. "You clean up good." "Clean up?" Vala frowned. She didn't think she'd done any housework. "It's a human expression," Mitch explained. "Means you're pretty." "Oh," Vala flushed. "Thank you." The human led her to the kitchen and made her food. Pancakes, he called them. Mitch covered them with melted butter and a sticky sweet syrup called maple. They were amazing. She would have loved them even if she wasn't half-starved. They chatted while they ate. She told him the story of her doomed salvage mission and Vinta's betrayal. He shared some anecdotes about his life as a fellow tech hunter. When she'd eaten her fill, Vala dropped the question she'd been meaning to ask. "Are all humans as big as you?" Mitch chuckled. "Well, most of us are bigger than you. You're a tiny thing." His smile was infectious. "We were pretty shocked at how small everyone was when we got into space." The smile widened into a grin. "But no, I'm pretty big. Definitely above average." "I see." She was staring at his arms again. She tore her eyes away, then yawned. The human yawned himself, stretching. "Well, I guess I should show you your quarters. You look like you could sleep for a week." He stood. Vala stood too. "No," she told him. She should be sleeping. She was clean and full and safe, exhausted too. She wasn't ready to sleep yet. The need to sleep was superseded by another, more primal need. "No?" Mitch frowned. "Take me to your quarters," Vala demanded. The human had stoked this fire. It was his responsibility to quench it. The human blinked. "What?" "Take me to your quarters," Vala repeated. She slipped out of the oversized shirt and stepped closer to him. She put a hand on his chest. Her smile was as predatory as any squealing. "I want to see what else you have that's big."